rather than reading a history book.
Well, I fell in love with history through historical fiction. I hated history when I was in school.
Well, it was the way it was taught.
Yes, because we had to memorize the causes of the 100 Years' War.
Remember the 100 Years' War? I loved the 100 Years' War. They had the truce of God and the peace of God. They didn't fight on Christmas Day.
Yeah,
so silly.
yes, but I can't tell you what the causes of it were, and I learned them.
The French didn't like the English.
And this is news.
I know.
And the vice will always be versa. But it really did not engage me. But when I was 14, my mother had gotten a book out of the Paterson, New Jersey Public Library called Catherine by Anya Seton.
Oh, yes.
And my mother was, this is a woman who was married to John of Gaunt. She was actually Geoffrey Chaucer's sister-in-law. And and I started to read that book. I was an avid reader, and that was my first.
I loved her books, Anya Seton.
Yes, and I loved that book, and that got me interested in historical fiction. And historical fiction is fiction. It's not history, but anybody who's handling history well in that context is going to give you a lot of an idea of what it was really like to have feet on the ground.
Exactly, exactly.
in
But you
places.
didn't really start your writing career with fiction, did you?
No, well, no. I wanted to be a novelist when I was 9 years old, but I grew up a poor working class kid in Paterson, New Jersey. And I don't know how much our viewers know about Paterson, but the way I describe it is, it's a lot like Newark, but without Newark's advantages. It
doesn't have the PATH train.
No, it doesn't have a PATH train. It doesn't have a museum or a concert hall.
Newark is interesting.
It is. It does have advantages, but I love stories. I've always wanted to tell stories, but I didn't aspire. I aspired to getting the best education I can. I was a scholarship student, and then I also aspired to go and live in New York City, which I did when I was a young woman. And eventually I became a consultant in the subject of management. So I wrote actually I wrote 5, but I wrote 4 nonfiction books before I started to write fiction in earnest. I had written it all my life, but I didn't ever really write it for publication.
But also nonfiction is easier to publish than
Oh,
fiction.
much.
Yeah.
Much.
You have
It's
a
much
topic-
easier to get on television if you're writing
Yeah, I mean,
nonfiction.
if you have a topic that's of interest and people want to find out how to do it or what it's about and whatnot, it's just much easier. Fiction is just walk into a bookstore and look at your competition.
Right, and it's it gives fewer opportunities to reach out for a public to make oneself known, because for nonfiction, I always had lots of television interviews, lots of radio interviews, because especially the last 2, the 4th and then the 5th book, that nonfiction that I wrote were about what you do if you have a bad boss. And the last time I looked at the data, 60 to 80% of people said they had a problem with their boss. So I wrote a book called Never Work for a Jerk, and I wrote a book called Monster Boss, and those gave me lots of
That's how you got your agent for your fiction books, yes.
That's right. I wrote a 5th
That's the hardest
nonfiction.
thing, is to get an agent or a publisher to publish your fiction book.
That's right. I couldn't
So-
get an agent. I had my first novel, City of Silver, was ready to be published, I thought. And in year 8 of having one agent read it, what he told me I should do is that I should change the story so that the main investigator of the crime was a priest, not the abbess who, and because and I thought, right, I'm going to change this so that all these women in this convent have this terrible problem with this dead body, and a man is going to swoop in and save the day.
No
I
fun
don't
at all.
think so. I don't think
No.
so. So I was desperate. So I offered to write a fifth nonfiction book, following up on my quite successful Never Worked for a Jerk. The agent for that sold that book. I then had to write it. And when I delivered it, she asked me, what's next? And I said, I have this novel. And I was on the phone with her, and this is what her voice sounded like. She said, I didn't know you wrote fiction. And I said, yes, I have this novel. And she sighed, and she said, okay. Send me 30 pages. You would have thought I was asking her to give up chocolate for the rest of her life. You know, she wasn't interested. When she read the first 30 pages, she called me up and she said, is this book finished? And I said, yes. And she said, I can sell this book.
Wow.
And she did. She sold it in 4 days.
Now, you never got into the self-publishing
No,
thing.
I never
You
did.
never had to.
Well, in those, self-publishing is big now. But I'm talking about the 10 years between 1999 and 2009, and self-publishing wasn't what it is now.
I think it's very interesting, the different trends in books the last, I would say, maybe 5 to 10 years, in that self-publishing has become so big. Stories about women's issues and about women's stories have become so big. Stories about gay folks have become so big. I mean, this is something, these are genre that really struggled at one time, and now they're really, it's wide open. It's
Yes.
wonderful that society has allowed this to occur.
Yeah, I think so too. It's all embracing now. There's always been gay fiction. There's always been, wonderful women writers.
Yes.
But
But I mean, women's stories
Yes.
really are really so popular now.
yes, right.
And it's great.
Well, 80% of the book buyers in the United States are women.
80%.
80.
That's really frightening.
Now they
I'm
say,
sorry.
I know it is frightening. It is frightening, and we won't go to
No.
anything about that, the politics of that. But there is a notion that although 80% of the books are bought by women, that many. That women are doing the book shopping,
Yes.
and that men are also reading those
And
books.
also
I certainly
children.
hope they are.
And also children. Women buy a lot of books for kids.
Yes,
I mean,
yeah.
grandmothers, mothers. We have about a minute left.
Is that all?
How
Wow,
about
fast.
giving our viewers some words of advice from a successful writer?
Well, one thing I would like to do is to say that I did make a little foray into self-publishing with a new anthology called Sunshine Noir, which I edited. It's an anthology of short crime fiction, which I edited with a friend, Michael Stanley. And that is a collection of not Nordic noir, not the cold country noir, but stories that take place in hot places all over the globe.
Oh, how interesting.
And so that's, I think, what I did want to emphasize that too. In terms of words of
Quickly.
wisdom, words of wisdom, put your tush in a chair, put your hands on the keyboard and make words come out. Unless you do that, you can't be a writer.
Thank you so much, Anna Maria.
That was lovely.